Welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and tonight's program, Artmaking and Incarceration with Nicole Fleetwood and Maria Gaspar. My name is Sampada Ranke and I'm an assistant professor of art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Art Institute. I have the pleasure of having some opening remarks today. I just want to start by thanking the Terra Foundation for American Art for generously supporting tonight's program. In her 2014 to 2016 series, Wretched and Paramount, artist Maria Gaspar uses 3D imaging from Google Maps to tour Cook County Jail. What gets produced are stunning engagements with a surreal landscape of incarceration that speaks to the conundrum of visibility embodied by these spaces. The images account for the overwhelming scale and architectural presence of the jail, while they also demonstrate how the algorithm cannot render the intricacies of the internal details of the space because they remain unseen by the technology itself. These works speak precisely to the logic of sight that the prison industrial complex relies upon. The paradox of being at once hyper-visible in terms of the overwhelming and unequal distribution of power vis-a-vis policing, surveillance, and prisons, as well as invisible in terms of keeping out of sight the horrendous conditions and practices those on the inside must endure. I believe that this nuance and complex engagement is precisely why Nicole Fleetwood chose this to be a featured work in her 2021 exhibition, marking time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Fleetwood's exhibition presented works featured in her book of the same title. Both the book and exhibition exemplify her generosity and critical insight. Fleetwood carefully encourages her viewers and readers to reconsider the terms of aesthetics and politics, asking us to question those very systems we've inherited that undergird our subjectivity, whether we know it or not. Take, for example, Nicole's careful insistence to not reiterate the false binary between inside and outside. As she writes, that binary upholds and justifies the idea that the prison industrial complex only impacts a select few, when in fact the system conditions, albeit to unequal degrees, and structures everyday life in the US writ large. As Fleetwood so insightfully insists, it is the artwork made by these incarcerated and non-incarcerated artists that encourages a deep engagement with these systems, one that might ask us to think and rethink the project of freedom as it is currently engaged. I quote from her brilliant text here for us, quote, "Incarcerated artists are involved in forms of innovation that fundamentally contest dominant frameworks of aesthetics, criminalization, and imprisonment. They engage in art making that upends how aesthetics and the production of art within Western thought and culture belong to the domain of the discerning, mobile, sensory, white, and free Western man who ascribes value and judgment. Carceral aesthetics as relational practices reposition the viewing and discerning subject away from Western racial hierarchies to create affective possibilities of belonging, collectivity, and subjecthood from positions of unfreedom." Thank you, Nicole, for that. This invitation to imagine and enliven a radically different kind of aesthetics and politics, one that imagines a world where many of us are set free from the violences of the prison industrial complex, is one of grace and generosity to see, feel, and sense anew. Tonight we have the gift to enter such an imaginative space with Fleetwood and Gaspar. Nicole R. Fleetwood is the inaugural James Weldon Johnson Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication in the Steinhardt School at New York University and 2021 MacArthur Fellow. She is the author of Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, winner of the National Book Critics Award in Criticism, the John Hope Franklin Publication Prize of the American Studies Association, the Suzanne M. Glasscock Humanities Book Prize for Interdisciplinary Scholarship, and both the Charles Rufus Maury Award in Art History and the Frank Jewett Mather Award in Art Criticism. She is also curator of the traveling exhibition, Marking Time, Art in the Era of Mass Incarceration, which debuted at MoMA PS1 in 2020, and has received praise by critics from the New York Times, The New Yorker, and Hyperallergic. Her other books are on racial icons, Blackness in the Public Imagination, and Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness. Fleetwood has also co-edited several projects, and her writing appears across noteworthy publications including Callaloo, American Quarterly, Aperture, and Art Forum, to name but a few. Fleetwood has co-curated exhibitions and public programs on art and mass incarceration at MoMA PS1, Zimmerli Museum of Art, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, Abrams Engel Institute for the Visual Arts at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Andrew Friedman Home, Aperture, Cleveland Public Library, Mural Arts Philadelphia, Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site, and Worth Rises. She is the inaugural Genevieve Young Writing Fellow of the Gordon Parks Foundation. Her work has been supported by Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, American Council of Learned Societies, the Art for Justice Fund, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers in the New York Public Library, Whitting Foundation, New Jersey Council for the Humanities, Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, Ford Foundation, Puffin Foundation, and Denniston Hill Residency. Maria Gaspar is an interdisciplinary artist negotiating the politics of location through installation, sculpture, sound, and performance. Gaspar's work addresses issues of spatial justice in order to amplify, mobilize, or divert structures of power through individual and collective gestures. Her work spans formats and durations, including sound performances at a military site in New Haven, long-term public art interventions at the largest jail in the country, appropriations of museum archives, and audio-video works documenting a jail located in her childhood neighborhood. Gaspar has received the Guggenheim Award for Creative Arts, Latinx Artist Fellowship, United States Artist Fellowship, the Frieze Impact Prize, the Sor Juana Woman of Achievement Award in Art and Activism from the National Museum of Mexican Art, and the Chamberlain Award for Social Practice from the Headland Center for the Arts. Maria's projects have been supported by the Art for Justice Fund, the Robert Rauschenberg Artist as Activist Fellowship, the Creative Capital Award, the Joan Mitchell Emerging Artist Grant, and the Art Matters Foundation. Gaspar has lectured and exhibited extensively at venues including MoMA PS1, the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and the Institute of Contemporary Art Los Angeles. She is associate professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, holds an MFA in Studio Arts from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and a BFA from Pratt Institute. This evening's program will open with brief presentations by Nicole and Maria. They will each spend about 10 minutes sharing their work with us, which will be followed by a conversation between them both about their practices, the theme of art making and incarceration, and their collaborations. We will end the evening by taking questions from the audience. Please join me very loudly and warmly in welcoming Maria Gaspar and Nicole Fleetwood.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. It's a joy to be here in Chicago. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Southwest Ohio. And it is such a great pleasure to be in conversation with Maria, whose work I deeply admire. And we realize that we haven't been in person, I think, since 2016.
Yeah, I think so. Too long.
Too long. Thankfully, we've been in conversation, though, during that time. I just want to kind of informally walk you through some slides associated with Marking Time, especially for those of you who might not be familiar with it. But I want to avoid doing what I do all the time, which is lecture. So for me, it's really important to just let anyone I know who's being exposed to marking time, especially for the first time, to share that this is a project that started in the most intimate and modest ways that I can speak of, and that is through looking at pictures by myself of my incarcerated relatives, and really meditating on how prisons have impacted my family, have impacted the street I grew up on in Southwest Ohio, and the neighborhood, it was called the Second Ward, where that was largely populated by working class and working poor Black folks. And just growing up, especially by the time I reached junior high in the late 80s, into high school, seeing especially so many boys in my neighborhood just swept up by the carceral system. And as I went on and got my bachelor's degree and then went to grad school at Stanford, I couldn't shake the trauma of that and the mass disappearance of people, of young people in my community. And so I started this project it started in my home in Harlem, where I just started hanging up photographs of incarcerated relatives. And then I started talking about it publicly when people would invite me to give talks at universities or community centers or art institutes. And I just talked really like anecdotalized. I would talk about my cousin DeAndre, who's in this picture here with my Aunt Frances. And from there, it just started to grow, where every time I go and share, people would share in return and would say, oh, I've been incarcerated, or my father was incarcerated, or I know an artist in prison you should connect with. And over the course of years, I met hundreds and hundreds of people who would share these stories with me, and I started interviewing people and not knowing where the project was going to go. Like, I didn't have an end goal. I just know, it just felt right. Like, it felt like I was doing something that was actually ridding my family of the shame of imprisonment, but also connecting with a bigger community of people who were part of this collective trauma of the carceral system. And as I talked to more people, I started to do formal interviews and meet artists who were in prison. And I just want to show you some of the artwork that came to me over the course of 10 years of research. And one is this work by Ronnie Goodman, who was incarcerated for 10 years at San Quentin. And after leaving prison in 2009, he was unhoused in San Francisco for many years and actually passed away on the streets of San Francisco during COVID. And so I also like to use this space to honor his memory and to say what an impact he had on me. It took me years after seeing this painting, this self-portrait he made, to actually talk to him, because he was unhoused and he was living in settlements, and had a contact at the public library who would check messages for him. And after a couple of years, we were able to connect by phone. And what he shared with me actually became the kind of theoretical framework for marking time. And one was thinking about penal space and the space where art is made inside prisons, but also how that space connects in very powerful ways to the work of Maria's, also looking at penal space, thinking about the architecture of prisons, the built environment, but also thinking about the intimate, the psychic and social relations that are created through prisons. Talking to Ronnie about penal space, and I started to think, like, what are the conditions under which people make art in captivity, and how is that connected to the art made by socially engaged artists outside of prison, who are not in prison, but who are very much still impacted by systems of punishment, surveillance, and captivity. And, you know, also talking to art students who are like experimenting with space, matter, time, that these are conditions under which art gets created, and how is that then reframed when one is held under punishment, when is held in punitive captivity. My work focuses largely on visual art, so I got obsessed. I mean, like really obsessed, waking up in the middle of the night thinking about, well, like how are people getting art supplies? And that for me was this really incredible aha moment when I started talking to people like Dean Gillespie about innovating with found objects, with trash, with leaves found on the prison yard. Dean spent 20 years in prison. He actually called me today to tell me he received a $100,000 grant for a documentary that's about his life and his experience in prison. So I want to celebrate him for that. But he would find objects and materials, discarded objects, and create these miniatures. And over the course of 20 years, created dozens of them. But not only was he making art, he was building this really amazing network. His social relations in prison were really restructured away from punishment, away from like the relationship with prison guards and staff to like other people held in captivity who became part of the process of collecting materials for him to make art. And so I realized that there was like a whole relational practices that were actually being facilitated through art making inside prison. And for Dean and for other artists, it also became a way of managing what I call penal time, and that's time as punishment. So for many artists who are in captivity, they talk about the real struggle, the existential crisis of like living 5 to 10 years in a box, and that's a very different temporality than the temporality that we're sitting in right here, right now. And one way that artists really grappled with that was through art making and doing labor-intensive, super time-consuming work that became another meditation on time, and it became this aesthetic meditation on time. Kenneth Reams is an artist who was doing that while he was on death row in Arkansas. He was on death row for 27 years. He's now in general population. And during that time, he also was thinking about the business of punishment. And so this work, Capitalization, is from him asking other people, condemned people on death row, to empty their trash cans. And you can see it's a critique on carceral capitalism. But artists also think about time in really in kind of the longue durée of captivity. And this is a work by Jared Owens where he maps on to this icon of abolition, the Brooks slave ship, the blueprint of Ferreton prison where he was incarcerated for a decade. Here you see is a really well-known image of the Brooks slave ship from the late 18th century. And then Mary Baxter used time-based media, video, to also meditate on her experience of time in labor. She was and she was a pregnant woman in prison and went into labor and was shackled for 43 hours while in labor, and then ended up having an emergency C-section. And she traces her experience, her trauma, to the long history of Black women's forced reproduction and the control the state places on their bodies and sexuality. I want to show you like kind of what it looks like, the kind of working with artists and thinking through these practices that emerge through captivity and our critiques of captivity, what it then looks like for, to experiment with installing these works in a museum, especially a museum like MoMA PS1, which is a former public school, and the architecture of the building for many of the artists who visited, who were in captivity, said it was very reflective of prison architecture, especially the courtyard that you walk into. The artists were like, this looks like a prison yard. And so we had a lot of conversations about how to activate the space of the museum. And when you walk in, one of the first things you see is a poetic landscape neon by Sable Ely Smith that is also a critique of like the Blue Lives Matter, but thinking about what it means to take back the color blue from the carceral system that has made it a color of violence and punishment of millions of bodies. And then just want to kind of walk you through some of the installation. This is a work by Mark Lotney, who was released from prison in July, but at the time of this installation, he was still in prison, and was doing an exercise where he would do portraits of other incarcerated people. Each is a 20-minute sitting, and he continued that practice during COVID, and really I was thinking about also the extra levels of precarity placed on incarcerated people during the time of some of the most heightened periods of the pandemic. Here's one of the gallery rooms where you see works in conversation. Ashley Hunt, who's a professor at Cal Arts, in conversation with Jared Owens and Dean Gillespie. And for me, with this project, Marking Time, it's really important to have the work of people differently positioned around the carceral system in proximity and conversation, such as like having Maria's work in conversation with the work of Jesse Crimes, and to think about how they're working with also blues and kind of some of the color schemes, and what really thinking about carceral geographies or abolitionist geographies too, right? Thinking about like how do we take the vestiges of incarceration and what can we undo and remake of these structures. Works by Sable Ely Smith and Daniel McCarthy Clifford. I'm just going to move through because I'm about to run out of my time. And I want to end by showing you this wall that was dedicated to Ronnie Goodman, who was scheduled to participate in the opening activities of Marking Time at PS1, but then it was delayed because of COVID, and he died like 3 weeks before the show was to open. So we created this wall in honor of his work and legacy. So I'm going to pass it on to Maria.
Thank you, Nicole, so much. It's so nice to be here with you, and as Nicole mentioned, we haven't seen each other in a couple years, and but I feel like I've been still seeing you and connecting with you since then through the different programs and the show, and it feels like a real gift and like medicine to be here with you today, so thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about a couple of projects. I have a couple of video clips, probably too many slides. So, I'm based here in Chicago, and I love that Nicole started a little bit with her own backstory and her own relationship to carcerality by way of her family and her community. Much of my own experience comes by way of growing up near a place of incarceration on Chicago's west side at Cook County Department of Corrections. And the video clip that you just saw is a short GIF of the demolition I've been filming of Division 1 for the past year and a half now. And this is from pedestrian side, from the sidewalk. So this is what people see as a resident walking across a major strip. The jail has always been a part of our lives. If you grew up on the west side of Chicago in a place like La Villita, 26th in California is this sort of iconic part of the neighborhood, whether people like it or not. And I became interested in really talking about the jail and thinking about the people inside as a young organizer and community artist, working mostly with young people in my neighborhood, mostly Black and brown youth. and their own experience with law enforcement or criminality, and also by way of being a public artist and doing community murals in my neighborhood and thinking about space and power and visibility and invisibility. I had also visited the jail as a kid through a Scared Straight program. So my relationship to the jail has varied really over the years, and through several different projects, starting with a project called 96 Acres Project, which was a very long-term, multi-year project with lots of different organizers and artists. We began really thinking about what it means to have the largest single-site jail in the country, inside of your community, and what it means to be in community with the jail, with people who are incarcerated, and how we contend with it and how we think about it. So we started to organize over the years. But just to give you some context, when I talk about working with young people, really it was the young people that really, for me, highlighted different aspects of my neighborhood and thinking about space and power. So over the years, I've been doing projects where, I'm thinking about walls and buildings and architecture, the way that, in a place like Chicago, viaducts or other kinds of divisions separate people, like North Lawndale and South Lawndale, for example. But also the way that we can create alternative narratives of our community. This is a project I did with some youth some years ago. And I was thinking a lot about, the ways that we interact with space and public space, who has access, who doesn't, and how we can begin to intervene or make those divisions more porous. And I feel like, over the years, that's been my project of making those divisions porous or malleable, and finding ways of moving across and moving through. Some of my projects include doing things like doing skywriting over a detention center in Texas. This was a project with Castles and Rafa Esparza, who conceptualized the project and invited 80 artists to participate in this. This is at New Haven Correctional Center, where I worked with a group of young people from a local high school, very similar to the Cook County Jail project, where young people and community members were really thinking about what it means to have a jail in their community, and how they see it and how they don't see it. So over the years, I've been documenting through photography and sound and video the ways that Little Village residents or North and South Lawndale residents are interacting with Cook County Jail. This is the Mexican Day Parade setting up the floats on 26th and Sacramento. This is another event where I was thinking about, in which direction are people looking? Are people looking at the festival, or are they looking at the jail and thinking about the people inside of it? This is a shot from the number 60 bus, from the inside of the bus looking out onto the jail. And this is the same street from now Division 1 when we did a community tour through one of the projects. So we're looking out onto the same street. So the wall has continued to be a big part of my practice through community projects or individual projects. This is a video installation, 5-channel sound and video installation, where I recorded sound from that carnival event, where you sort of hear kind of pieces of metal, making sounds, as well as children's voices. And then I also did some recordings when I visited one of the divisions inside of the jail and kind of mashed up those sounds. So here's a little clip of that. And so what you see is a pan of the entire concrete wall of the jail. And here are some other iterations. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to kind of dislocate a very specific sited place and move it into, for example, the Chicago Cultural Center, one of the first libraries in the city of Chicago. Other iterations include creating the jail wall, using fabric and asking the viewers to remove the wall or to interact with it in some kind of way, really have a kind of embodied experience with something that feels maybe ghostly or haunting. Lots of my projects have also been, thinking about penal time and penal space, penal matter, thinking about the language of carcerality, the way that when you go onto, the Sheriff's Department websites, you read the kind of language that they use, and I started to create projects where I'm cutting up some of that language and trying to turn the language of confinement into the language of freedom. This is a shot from the MoMA PS1 show that I'm just so honored to be a part of. And then through a more collaborative process, we did a series of 8 cited public art projects through the 96 Acres Project, and this is a collaboration with Yollocalli Arts Reach, where the young people created stencils and then power washed them all over the perimeter of the jail. And then this is another project called Park. This is just a short excerpt where we wanted to create a sound installation using parked cars that coincide with the racial demographics of the jail, and almost like 90% were black and brown people and the rest white, and we crowdsourced 100 cars based on the racial demographics, so black, brown, and white cars. And then we asked people to tune in to a local radio station called Vocalo and then listen to some of the sound recordings that we produced. So here's a little clip of that.
You just see a black car after black car after black car. It's stark, but not surprising.
Just being that I have a white car, I thought it would be something cool to be a part of.
Apparently we had too many white cars, and so your car couldn't be part of the event, so what do you think about that?
I think it's messed up, really. I'm not sure how else to say it. Because too often we think about people as numbers, and sometimes it's just a little more striking to see it visually.
I think all of us value the importance and the significance of this project in attempting to change the look into one that is much more inspiring than it currently is.
So just moving ahead, Radioactive Stories from Beyond the Wall is a project that I did with people at Cook County Jail with detainees. And we worked for about 1.5 years or 2 years to produce audio and visual narratives that were then projected onto the jail wall through, projectors. And we worked with Lumpen Radio, a local radio station here, to do a live broadcast. And what we did is we really thought about penal matter, thinking about all of the physical aspects of confinement, and the detainees reflected on those different elements and then personified them through their own storytelling. Some of the stories were very humorous, some of them were very painful, and they were able to then record their own sounds through a little booth that we made using tables and sound blankets within one of the rooms inside of the jail, and then we did this projection on the outside. And some of the detainees had been released at the time that we did the installation, and they were able to come and talk about their experience and share their work. These are some of their beautiful drawings. This is a drawing by Douglas Johnson. And then our workshops sort of look like this. We drew, we talked, we brainstormed, and just really worked together to come up with the content and think about the direction of the project.
Nice concept. Gingerbread. Get back in the hole.
I like him right there.
Jordan, you know the picture. We gonna do the picture. And
A part of the good monster that's representing, you know what I'm saying? See, you gotta have a balance. You got the good, and then you got the bad.
You know, you have like Torn 4, then you have West Care, like different parts of the digestion.
Makes different parts of the machine.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Okay, and
We
then
came up with what we want to do is something to do with like a checker.
So I hope that gives you a little sense of, you know, what our gathering sort of looked like, you know. I'm not going to talk so much about all of, you know, what it took to just get recorders in and get materials in. There's a whole process to that, but luckily we were able to get some of those supplies in to do this project. So this is one of the manifestations here. This is a beautiful series of drawings by the artist Ramon Ali.
Imagine the wall that we see behind us as an amplifier, or the wall as speaker.
They incarcerate the body, but they also incarcerate the mind. They shut the mind down, which I think is not a rehabilitative process.
So that was Ali's mom who came through. So I'll just finish up with these two slides. I'm currently working on a project where I've been recording some of the frequencies of the jail bars that I've collected in other detritus from the demolition. And I initially didn't plan on doing a project like this until one day when I was shooting the demolition, somebody walked over a judge and handed me a bar. And that's sort of what led to me then thinking about what it means to kind of hold this material and attempt to transform it. So this is just a little snippet of what that's been looking like. So I'll end there. Thank you. So we wrote a couple notes down, so maybe I can kick things off if you don't mind, Nicole. Yeah, I mean, I think that something that is really apparent from, you know, thinking about your practice, Nicole, and the scholarship that you've done, and really how much you've influenced so many in your practice and in your work and in your exhibitions. And I was thinking so much about the aspect of intimacy in your work, in your writing, also in the way that you interact with the artists, you know, throughout all the different programs that you've done and the exhibition. And I feel like that is such an important part of your practice. And it's something that I feel is very tender, and it is also something that is very felt. And I was hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about how you think about intimacy in your practice, or how you, you know, how you think about it in your curatorial work. And
I feel the same about your work, so thank you for opening up with that question. You know, I think one of the most important lessons for me that I learned early in doing research was I presented at Cornell maybe in 2013, so I was pretty early in the research stage, and I was sharing what I had assembled image-wise, and an MFA student actually said to me during Q&A, he said, "You talk about your family with such intimacy, but you're so formal when you talk about artists, you don't know." And it was like an aha moment where I was like, oh, I want to be able to speak about everyone with the same kind of intimacy I speak about my family. And so then it really became this process of like, what does that look like for me in a way that also respects my own subjective boundaries. Like I'm an introverted person. I'm not someone who, you know what I mean? Like, so often people think of intimacy, you know, I'm not someone who, I have a very small circle. So it's how do you enact love and connection and belonging in a way that also feels very authentic to who we are as people. And so part of it for me is like in writing, which is my first love, was to write through a practice of beloved community and to want people to recognize themselves in the writing. And so it became an exchange. You know, you read what I wrote about you before it was published, and that's not what academics tend to do. So it became relational in that type of way. And I wanted to get as close to that experience as I could, with also while acknowledging that I've never been in prison. And so for me, the position was to become a student to the people I was actually researching, that they were the experts and I was a student. And so it just changed the whole dynamic. And I think to want to learn is a very intimate experience, like to really, not to want to study someone like as objects or artifacts or, you know, material for scholarship, but to really want to learn. And so that became, for me, it did feel very intimate working on the project. And I interviewed over 60 people, and what they were sharing was so intimate. And listening to that over and over really, it went into my body. Like listening, it really went into my body. It became a felt experience, yeah.
Yeah, that it makes me think a little bit about when I was working on the radioactive project with the group, and we named ourselves the ensemble. And when we were working together as part of the ensemble, I mean, we had this, you know, tiny room that, you know, me and my collaborator Michael de Anda Muniz had to, you know, go through multiple checkpoints, and then you finally get to the tier, and you see the group, people come in, and it's such a hard, you know, it's such a difficult space to work in, right? That's an understatement. But there was something about that moment when we started to build, when people started to come in and kind of become present in the space, that there were these moments where we felt like we were able to move differently. And some of the ensemble members, I remember talking about, you know, there were moments when there was lockdown, or there were a lot of barriers to, say, getting in or starting on time. And the ensemble would say, you know, we got to move around first. We got to do some, you know, performance exercises or just movement exercises to be in our bodies. And sometimes we'd be rushed. We're like, well, we got to go. We got to work on the project. And they'd say, no. Like, we have to stop. We have to take a moment to do this. Like, the work of being in the body in a place that sort of takes bodies or takes, you know, people, extracts them from their communities. It became more important for me to understand what that really means in that space, more than before, you know, and that's something that I really learned. And I think so much about that, and I think so much about something that one of the ensemble members said, Christopher Coleman. He said, you know, there was a moment where even the guards became unshackled. And when he said that, I was like, wow, that's incredible, right? Like, what an incredible statement to say, that it really, for me, felt really provocative in thinking about the way that, you know, you talk about it, which is, you know, carcerality isn't just about, right, who's on the inside or who's on the inside of those walls, but it's the way that it moves through entire communities. So that really kind of illustrated that for me, you know, in really deep ways.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, being held in captivity and loving someone who's being held in captivity, those are deeply intimate experiences. And you know, but the way that the carceral public kind of positions it as numbers, and so like as these anonymous beings out there, like millions of people are in there, right? And it's a deeply intimate, like anyone I know who's been handcuffed, they can't forget that experience of being handcuffed, of what it felt like. And that's just entering a system that just continues to take its toll on one's body, right? And what does it mean to I think there's so many beautiful, like the film Time by Garrett Bradley. There's been so many ways that people are kind of exploring this type of intimacy that has just been in the shadow, right? But so many millions of people are experiencing it, right?
I was also thinking a little bit about, you mentioned earlier in your presentation about, putting the work up in a museum. And, that's something that I often think about in the more community-based work that is often outdoors, it's sited, it's, very specific to a particular context and moment in time. But also, what it means to then take that work and put it in a more museum context. So how do you, in your practice, kind of grapple with those? Sometimes it feels like polar opposites. And how do you sort of make amends with that? Or can you talk about some examples?
Yeah, I've been, like with my students, especially grad students, we've been talking more about thresholds to institutions and thinking about the threshold to prisons and the threshold to museums, and how they keep certain people out and certain people in, right? And also centered around the logic of collecting. And so we've been thinking about what does it mean to change these thresholds, and I think you're doing that work beautifully with taking that wall and thinking about porosity, or thinking about like what a fabric or something, a different kind of materiality. I didn't go into this project to curate, but it became clear to me that it was not a project that should just live in a book. And I talked to several of the art, and also like I also understand that a lot of people are not comfortable entering museums. So I have, had the opportunity to do iterations in different settings, like at the New Brunswick Free Public Library, where many of its clients are formerly incarcerated people, and the Andrew Friedman Home in the Bronx, which is right across from the housing court, and in a building that has like social services, right? But I also recognize that the ambitions of a lot of the artists is to be in museums, artists who are considered, quote, professional artists, and also artists who are considered amateur. I don't like those categories, and those are not categories that I embrace. But when I talk with like many of the artists who are system impacted or who are still in prison about where they wanted to have the show, and they're like, of course I want to have a museum exhibition, of course. So, right, so as we are critiquing museums, people who've been locked out of museums for centuries or forever want access to that, and not just access as visitors, but access, like, to have their work there. And so I'm interested in transforming museums, because I think museums should ultimately be environments that are about creation and not just presentation. I think that they should be really, really like open to the public in the broadest sense, in the way that I believe a public library should be also, which a lot of libraries we know are also highly surveilled places. So I am interested in us rethinking the public through these institutions that we are living with, and actively transforming them. And I've seen some really amazing things happen around people participating in marking time through having their work in these various spaces. So it's not to say that I don't find museums to be highly problematic, but I'm someone who believes in possibility. And so I'm looking always thinking about how can we push this institution past its own imagining of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I also am thinking so much about all the programming that you've done through Marking Time. And I think this show has traveled to how many places now? 3 or 4?
4.
Yeah. And the programming is so rich, and there are no slides of the programming. But can you talk a little bit about maybe what's been generated through some of those conversations that you've been able to organize over the years?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most exciting things about I didn't realize how much I love programming, but I really love just how dynamic it can be to have people in conversation, but it doesn't have to just be, it can be all kinds of things, workshops. We've had our artists do collage workshops virtually. I think, we had an abolitionist symposium that we hosted virtually with MoMA PS1, and you participated in it, and kind of switching up who's in conversation with each other. One of my, a cherished conversation was when Sable Ely Smith talked to Daniel McCarthy Clifford, and Sable was a professor at Columbia, and Daniel was in federal prison, but they're working with similar materials and doing similar practices sculpturally, and they were just literally geeking out with each other. They were like, you do that too, you do that, and so it's seeing the affinities, right? These kind of affinities, and what I think for me has been most rewarding is all of the collaborations, initiatives, art installations that have grown out of Marking Time, but has nothing to do with me, that people are coming together. They've met through some iteration of this, but they're doing their own thing, or creating other collectives. And a lot of the artists who are in Marking Time, who are formerly incarcerated, are now interested in curating themselves, and they're curating shows. And and I want this to be something that is way beyond me, right? And so I think that's been most exciting, is to see me not have anything to do with the glorious things that people are doing in the world as a result of coming together through this initiative. And what about you with programming? Because I think that's such an important part of how your work is not meant to just be on walls, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of, pre-pandemic, right? Things were a little bit different. I think now things are beginning to open up a little bit more. So I think, one can sort of, at least for me, I've been thinking more about how to still stay connected. Throughout the pandemic, it was how does one, do social practice when you are socially isolated from one another, which was, obviously something we've all experienced. And, I think that I feel you when you're talking about how you kind of do projects and they sort of spur other things come out of it. And I think that's always an exciting time. I think for me, when I come out of a teaching practice too, teaching is a big part of my work, and art making, and a lot of times those things sort of blur together, and finding those moments when things are just being generated, right, without much necessarily you giving a very particular set of instructions, right? It's just, it's sort of manifesting in a way. And I think a lot about that, especially when, we're working in spaces that have been fragmented, by different kinds of systems of power, whether it's because of a lack of resources or a lack of space, or what have you. And I think so much about collage, or the way that material comes together, ideas come together, even within the space of fragmentation. And often the fragmentation is very intentional, right? That these systems are creating fragmentation on purpose and chaos. But then how does one kind of turn that into something that feels cohesive, or that feels rich, or that feels like it can move beyond itself. And I think the moments when we can come together either through an experience of some kind or maybe within a process, it feels like that's when it's really, for me, that's when that moment is happening of vitality, Like it's like we're doing something, we don't really know what to call it, but it feels right, it feels good. I don't know what's gonna happen, but that element of not knowing, but in a way that makes it feel rich, is a really moving experience, and I think a lot about that, like how does one create that space, how do we as artists or as organizers or as activists kind of create a space where we can also experiment and play, because a lot of times in these spaces, at least in my own life when I'm doing community projects, it feels like often there isn't space, or we're told there isn't space to play and experiment, and it takes a lot to really manifest that, and that's been a really important value for me over the years.
And we just got notified that it's a Q&A, but what I want to say about that's play is a radical act, right? Especially playing and like just getting off of the time that's controlled by carceral capitalism, right? Like that, because our time is supposed to be measured around money and whether we're warehoused or not warehoused in these spaces. And I think play is a really radical act, especially playing as adults, and I incorporate play into my self-care regimen on a weekly basis. Right. But how are we going to do Q&A? I think there's a mic a couple of mics going around. Great.
Hello, everybody. I am Devontae, and we will be doing the Q&A. We have 4 people. I have Nancy, Garrett, and Anya on the other side. We will be walking around. If you have a question, please raise your hand, state your name. Keep it brief because the presenters do have to leave. And and we can start now. Go ahead and raise your hand.
I have a question up here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Claire Pentecost, and I'm a professor emeritus from SAIC. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the discourse of abolition may enter your work.
And is that for both of us?
Sure. Or either one.
Yeah, I got to talk with some grad students earlier today, and I think for a lot of people who are not practicing, it sounds so far off and unrealistic. But I just think it starts with our most intimate relationships, and where we give space for all of people to show up, and for failure and disappointment and forgiveness and transformation, and really putting that into practice, which means also not knowing everything. And I think play and experimenting is a big part of it. So trying something and something doesn't work, but creating systems that are really about supporting, the full recognition of who we are as people on this planet. But I also think it goes beyond humans too. It's about our relationship to everything around us, and what we think, how we interact with water, air, life,
Hello. I guess my question is involving kind of capitalism and the carceral system and the art world and the artistic capitalism that we're all in or aspiring to be in, or something around that. And I guess navigating folks who are incarcerated, they're finding ways for their lives to not become material, or how you negotiate the kind of nuances, the fine line between what you're making, what they've made, and how it's presented, I guess. It always feels like a tricky thing to negotiate, and I wonder how you both feel about working in between those worlds.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you brought up the term threshold, which I think applies here too, and proximity. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for some of the projects that I've been involved in, most of them have been live projects, and they're happening, you know, on site, and they involve multiple people. You know, like Radioactive Project, for example, that included, you know, free write youth and literacy. It included the ensemble members, the family members, you know, and other artists that were also involved. So, you know, at least I try as much as possible through the documentation of the work, through kind of marking the work, to sort of capture the liveness of that work and the way that shows or tries to represent all the different kinds of interactions. But as we know, it's not, it doesn't capture all of the processes, you know, like you don't really see what was happening behind the scenes or the negotiation between, say, the guards and the project itself, or the sheriff's department and the way those negotiations happen. So it's also, you know, I try to also preface it like, you know, what you're seeing here is just a little excerpt of the bigger project, and it by no means really captures the fullness of it. I think when you're actually at the live event, you can really experience more of it and really see and experience lots of different people's perspectives. And you know, it's just the challenge of doing that kind of work. And so it's something that is still, for me, like a work in progress. And I don't think I've hit it exactly, but I'm, you know, sort of working towards figuring out how best to negotiate that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your question. And, you know, and for me, it is never being on autopilot with this work, you know. So it remains relational. I mean, there are people who have wanted to change their work in that traveling exhibition. It's like constantly having a conversation with people, making sure people are compensated for their time in participating in the exhibition, showing up in ways that people are asking me to show up. I write parole letters a lot, write grant applications for people, you know. So it's really like I mean, it's just not transactional, just making sure that I am checking in with myself about why I'm still doing this work, and that if I ever get on autopilot, that means that I shouldn't be doing this work anymore. Like, I mean, it's constantly being aware of and also completely aware of my privilege, you know, and that I've acquired more privilege as a result of this work. So it's, you know, there's no denying that I have received a lot of currency, cultural, academic, you know, in various ways as a result of this work. And so I'm never in denial about that, especially when I'm interacting with some of the artists who are still in prison, you know, and they're happy that their work is getting recognized, but they're still in prison.
Hi, my name is Miles. I just had a quick question in regards to the potential backlash you guys may face from doing a lot of the internal work within the carceral system. So I'm just like curious if you think, this is kind of for both of you guys, if you feel like you guys would be limited in some way with your work from potential backlash that you may receive. So I'm just curious what you guys' thoughts are on that.
And you talking about like backlash from anybody or? Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think at some point, my collaborator and I were trying to work with the women's division at the jail, and we faced quite a bit of backlash because we had a set program time where we were going to enter and do our project, and we had spent a lot of time negotiating that and setting it up. But we just, each time we'd go in, there was something happening that would compete with the program. So commissary, for example, would be scheduled all of a sudden. It was coming at the same time. Or maybe they decided to show a film to the group, and people would prefer sometimes the film, right? Like sometimes that was a nice thing to do. But also people preferred commissary, right? They want to get things from commissary. So, and then there was also just, we felt that, I don't know, there was a sense of resentment, and I think from some of the guards that we talked to, I remember them asking, like, why are you here? Like, they don't deserve it. They don't deserve this. And that was a really challenging thing for us to experience because we really wanted to be there. We really wanted to work with the group. But at a certain point, it was impossible. So we went back to the previous division and continued working with the men. So, I mean, but I think for people who work in prisons and jails, I think they might say something similar about, like, the way that, the different kinds of, populations might be either accessible, less accessible, but it's also like, it just depends on who's there, who's sort of on guard, quite literally, and whether or not they're going to let you. So there was that backlash that we experienced. And of course, like for all of the projects, really, I mean, all of the cited projects at the perimeter of the jail or inside, they all had to go through the department, the sheriff's department. So there was always some kind of review that was happening. And, that's something that we talked about at the ensemble is like, we were also talking about like what it means to do a public project on a jail wall, that it wasn't just any wall, it was a jail wall, and we understood that there's certain content that maybe we couldn't, right, talk about, that we wanted to talk about. So, but, then we talked about, like, how do we subvert that in some kind of way? How do we still talk about it in a way that maybe is, through humor or through, image or sound, so we just tried to find other ways of still kind of embodying it, yeah.
I don't work directly in prisons and jails. I've done interviews and site visits, so I think Maria's response is right on. What I would say is that what concerns me more is not backlash, but like how some corrections, departments of corrections or carceral institutions have tried to incorporate my work, like in some ways, and kind of miss the political critique and then try to kind of romanticize the art and use it to valorize their work. But I also feel like I know I can't control people's interpretations and what they do with the work. I'm just trying to do the work that feels like the work I should be doing. The gentleman in the blue sweater has had his hand up the entire.
Communicate with many artists than was in prison. Do you think if they were not in prison, their art will be different or the same, or whatever you think about it?
I think, yeah, their art is definitely shaped by those conditions. And part of it is, a huge part of it for a visual artist is material scarcity, just the lack of access to art supplies. So in that way, incarcerated artists will innovate and using, you know, bed sheets and soap and toothpaste and, you know, whatever they can get their hands on. One artist out in California did this beautiful sculpture of a motorcycle using rodent bones that he had found on the prison yard. So definitely the art is shaped by the conditions of captivity. And some of the artists I've talked to have described the challenge of making art once they're released from prison, because part of their practice, their daily practice, had been about forging materials and, you know, about like really working against the system by using the materials of the system to make art. And so it's a kind of rewiring of their aesthetic horizons once they're released. Thank you.
It seems we got time for just one more small question. We got one up in the front. Garrett?
Hi, my name's Elena. I was wondering about something that Ms. Fleetwood, you had said early on in the discussion. You kind of mentioned the idea that the inside versus the outside of the system is like a false binary, and that we're all kind of perhaps like all existing in a sense where we're like affected by the system due to maybe like surveillance and that kind of thing. And I just wanted to hear a little more about that.
Well, I definitely don't think we're all impacted in the same way, and I want to make that really clear. But I think that we have normalized punitive governance, that we live in a society where we're always threatened with punishment. You know, if you don't pay your taxes, if you jaywalk, if you don't send your child to school on time. And we've normalized it, and in normalizing it, we've made it okay to keep, you know, 2 million people in cages, to separate parents from their children, to depopulate entire blocks and neighborhoods. And I think that that's really the crisis of our social life, of our political life, of you know. But it's also weird. It's the vestiges of settler colonialism too, you know.